Hey everybody, so this week we're talking about hard effects and Foley. So the main components of getting sound effects into these post-production projects. We've already gone over backgrounds and those atmospheric sort of sounds, the ones that define an environment or a location, and soft effects, which are a little bit more specific, but still aren't really tied to anything visual. So that's where things really change here. So now hard effects and Foley, which is a method of recording hard effects, are sounds that are going to be used in your sound design for these post-production sequences and stuff that really have a direct connection to something that's happening visually that the audience is interpreting. So, this is a super amount of fun, but it's also a tremendous amount of work. We get to be super creative in this process, but we also have to be very diligent to synchronize things appropriately, because if we have sound effects that are not synchronous with the visual action, then we're going to start to have some issues. We're basically, at that point, we're sort of breaking the illusion that these things are really happening the way the audience hopes that, or we intend the audience to feel, and we don't want to disengage the audience from the material. We want them to be lost in the story and all that. So we'll go through some examples, and we'll talk a little bit about recording techniques in a theoretical sense, and I think you'll get a pretty good grasp on what's going on here. Okay, so hard effects are those sound effects that sync with visual action. There's something that's happening on screen that the audience now has, some sort of anticipation for. They have an expectation that whatever they're seeing is going to have some sort of sonic reaction, right? And we have to either meet that expectation or exceed it somehow. So a lot of what we talk about, you'll start to notice too when you're watching movies and TV, is that the sound effects that you hear are usually larger than life, right? Like, for the most ridiculous example, if you can think of like an old 70s like kung fu movie or something like that, a punch to the face doesn't really sound the way it's interpreted in those sort of scenarios, right? A punch to the face doesn't really sound like much at all, actually, but when you see it in a movie, in a big action sequence, that sound is likely coupled with a bunch of other sounds to make it sound larger than life. Alright, we just discussed this. So, same thing goes with like an explosion or a body fall or alien noises, things that are, completely fictitious. We have to make them meet the audience expectation, or sometimes like even go beyond that. And in which case they are often bigger than they necessarily would be in real life. Alright, so we have to fulfill these expectations to keep the audience engaged. That's really what we're doing. We're telling a story. We want the audience to be lost in that story. We want them to really be living it. So we can't do anything that's going to break that attention. Okay, so here's a cool little example about sound effects, sort of a little behind-the-scenes documentary-style thing. It's a little bit older, but it has to do with Brett Burt, who's sort of the king of sound design, and he did all the sounds for Star Wars and a bunch of other like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg movies. So enjoy.
Welcome to SST. I'm Robert Guillaume, and I'll be your guide for a new primetime program, screen, stage, and television, which takes us inside the fascinating world of show business. This may look like an attic, but it's actually a warehouse which holds the stuff from all the Star Wars films. Our story is about the man who breathed life into these unforgettable characters. He calls himself a sound designer, but that hardly does justice to the talent that won him 3 Academy Awards and has kept moviegoers on the edge of their seats for more than a decade. If it looks like this man is playing the piano, you're wrong. He's actually looking for the perfect scream. His name is Ben Burt, and in the movie business, he's considered the Wizard of Oz of sound. At his fingertips, the end result of decades of sound effect research. You've heard those pitiful screams in some of the most sensational movie blockbusters in history. How about a little fire with a scream? Then these high-tech sounds became the ultimate battle of the Death Star. But if you're thinking this is a story about electronic gizmos that produce special sound effects for movies, you're mistaken. This is a story about some of the greatest secrets in the movie business. Some of those secrets involve a styrofoam coffee cup, a fat red cabbage, and this elderly lady from Tucson, Arizona. Things that hardly seem high-tech. In fact, despite all this fancy equipment, Ben Burtt's approach to sound effects is pretty old-fashioned.
I've always had dreams of being a newsreel cameraman in some ways. You know, you read about the stories back in the 30s of the men that worked for Pathé News or Movie Tone running around the world with their cameras trying to capture the sounds of, you know, humanity and warfare and so on.
When Ben needs a sound, he doesn't rely entirely on these computers. He goes out and looks for it. One day he looked for and recorded some bears.
It wasn't a simple recording session. Bears don't sit down in front of a microphone and just emote. You have to just sort of document whatever they'll do.
With a lot of playing around, those bear sounds became Chewbacca the Wookiee. Burt was very fussy about how Chewie was going to sound. He told us what he did.
Slow the recordings down, maybe speed other things up, and manipulate the bits of recordings. And I would have essentially started a word list for the Wookiee.
All right, don't lose your temper. I'll come right back and give you a hand.
With R2-D2 of Star Wars, Ben ran into a problem. How do you make this little guy sound human? Ben tried a computer.
But that didn't give the character its warmth. It sounded more like, you know, just a machine reacting or something inert. And I was kind of frustrated with all the electronic noises I made. So I just decided I grabbed the microphone and I just made some funny sounds into it.
Finally, Burt blended human sounds with electronic sounds. What you're hearing now is the production soundtrack from Star Wars. That means you're only hearing the actual sounds taking place on the movie set. There are no sound effects yet. Watch, but also listen.
Okay, look at the door.
Now watch the scenes and listen what happens after Ben Burt steps in.
Did you hear that? They shut down the main reactor.
All the sounds Ben comes up with are entered into his computer system and called up later by hitting the various piano keys. But to find the sounds to begin with, it still takes plain old imagination, like the sound of a Honda Civic, which ended up in one of the most exciting adventure scenes ever filmed.
Instead of starting the engine, I just took the brake off the car and we started rolling down the hill on this gravel road with rather large gravel, rough road. And as we started to accelerate in the car, we realized that the rolling car sounded very interesting. And so we stopped immediately and we got our microphones out and we put a microphone under the car just a few inches from the back tire.
So what Ben had discovered accidentally, a car rolling down a gravel road, became this.
White cabbage being hit with knot in the end of undershirt wet. Take one.
Like an old-time radio sound man, Ben Burt is the guy directors look to for ingenuity. Here he is smacking a cabbage in these home movies. Try to guess what he was looking for.
We tried all kinds of different things. Oh, you know, pitching things in the catcher's mitts and swinging baseball bats into leather jackets and beating cabbages. Okay, this will be punching red cabbage with boxing glove. Take one.
When it comes to certain sounds, there's nothing better than the real thing. And that sometimes can be dangerous. That's Ben recording ricocheting rifle shots. Here he is, strapped into a biplane. Most of the time, Bert is a kind of sound explorer who looks for sounds anywhere he can find them, like behind his own TV.
And I was listening to the recorder while I had the microphone plugged in, and the microphone happened to pass behind the picture tube on the television set that was just sitting there running. And it picked up a signal just by induction from the back of the picture tube. It made a strange sputtering hum in my headphones. It was coming directly into the microphone. So I said, wow, that sounds like a laser sword.
A little further experimentation, and finally, a grown man setting fire to a styrofoam coffee cup? After Star Wars, everyone considered him Dr. Sound. He told us about the time he got a call from Steven Spielberg. Something about a movie he was doing starring a cute little alien.
And it doesn't speak English. It's making strange grunts and groans and maybe muttering in its own home language.
This was Ben's solution. An elderly lady he met in a photo shop.
A young man came over to me and introduced himself and said, did I always speak in that low voice? And I said, yes, it's the only voice I have.
Meet Pat Welch, the voice of E.T.
I wouldn't say he was just a taskmaster. I would say he was a perfectionist.
A sample of E.T. as directed by Steven Spielberg and Ben Burtt.
Ouch. Ouch. Elliot.
What?
Elliot. 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 E.T., E.T., E.T. E.T., E.T., E.T. Be good. Phone home, phone home, phone home, phone home. Oh.
E.T. phone home?
E.T. phone home.
And finally,
I'll always be right here. I'll be right here.
as for Ben Burtt, hopefully he'll always be right here, coming up with the sounds that you will be hearing at a theater near you. Right now, he's finishing what he thinks is his most challenging assignment, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Ben says it's the culmination of years of sound effects research.
Oh, rats.
When you see it, we know you'll be watching intently. Having met Ben, hopefully you'll be listening just as carefully.
Beating sound man with rubber hose. Take two. That's about does it.
All right, pretty cool little video there. So I want to make sure that you guys understand that this is the difference between, you know, making sound effects and like the process in which you're creating them. So he's recording sound effects and doing all this research as opposed to actually performing Foley, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So recording your hard effects, since we're not actually, you know, too capable of, there's no expectation that you have fancy microphones and that we're using the studio at this point. So we're going to be doing a lot of, you know, researching and downloading of existing sounds from libraries. But if we were recording, we'd be considering these things. Recording all our sound effects in stereo, because we can always split those things up and make it mono later if we needed to. But we might as well use a stereo pair and really collect, you know, the stereo image of the sound, just in case, you know, just to have it. If we don't use it, fine, but you can't take something mono and make it stereo, but you can split something that's stereo and make it mono. So you would likely want to have a stereo pair. Sometimes, though, you would want to have an alternate pair as well. So because you don't know, you know, when you're in there and you're punching a cabbage, let's say, with a boxing glove, you know, those are some unusual types of activities to be doing. So you might wind up being a little overzealous with something, and you might need an extra set of microphones that has a lower gain level so that you can, you know, you don't have to necessarily waste a take or something like that. You've got two different versions of microphones that are capturing things at different levels, so you've always got a quality recording. So that's the idea there. And when you're doing this, again, we're talking about recording sound effects without seeing the visual action, right? So we're just creating a large collection of these sounds that we can refer to and we have like sort of in our back pocket that we can use whenever we want. So you want to take a whole bunch of different recordings. For example, if you're like breaking some glass, you know, maybe you want to break a glass window. Maybe you want to drop the glass. Maybe it's a smaller piece of glass, like a wine glass, and you want to drop it on its side, or you want it, you know, to break into a lot of pieces, or you want it to be slow or fast. You know, you need to be very comprehensive in the way that you do this, and be descriptive when you're creating the titles for these audio files, because you want to be able to easily search between them and make sense out of them. And believe it or not, there are people whose sole purpose, whose job it is to continually grow these libraries of sound effects. So just constantly being creative and collecting a whole bunch of just different sounds, and again, making sure that they're comprehensive. So because if it's the same gunshot, people are going to notice. Actually, I forgot to add this into my slide, but we might as well take a look at this. So I wanted to show you an example of something that's been overused, and that is the Wilhelm scream. You heard a little bit of it actually in that video with Ben Burt, but it is you know, a scream that has been used in movies as sort of like a sound designer's joke for years and years. So here's a compilation of it being used. This is when where it's first from. Keep in mind, this is all the same movie right there. George Lucas and Steven Spielberg probably of the most overusers. Alright, well, you get the idea, but I mean, basically, I mean, this one was used as sort of a joke, so it's sort of like an inside joke between sound designers in the industry and stuff like that. But there are other things like that exist. If you were to use the same sound from multiple things, then, you know, it would get pretty old pretty fast, and people will notice. You know, like it becomes obvious. Okay, so one more. This is just an example of some of the crazy amount of work that winds up going into creating all these hard effects for a sequence and making sure that you synchronize them appropriately. This scene is the Omaha Beach opening sequence from Saving Private Ryan. So if you haven't seen it, it's definitely it's violent and it's gory, but it's an incredible showcase of sound design. And what I want you to be thinking of when you see this is, one, the sheer number of sound effects that are around, and then some of those things about the 5 perceptions of sound. So sometimes dealing with volume and proximity and color and perspective. So really be considering those things. It's a longer sequence. We'll watch probably about 5 minutes of it. But really just take in and think critically about all these different things that are happening. Here we go.
see you on the beach.
So, I mean, what a cool example of sound design. I mean, I know it's gruesome and it's violent, but what an amazing example of, you know, the amount of work that has to go into a sequence like this. I mean, just think of the sheer number of sounds and ways in which they are used and interpreted in here, and how much work must have gone into that. How much perspective there is, the panning, how the sounds sound like they're coming from different places or from different distances. Pretty amazing stuff. What I wanted to make sure that I highlight is, you know, a lot of times a sound has a bunch of different reactionary sounds as well, right? So let's take, for example, a gunshot in this sequence. We're just thinking about a gunshot. It's not just the gunshot that we're going to hear, right? So there's the handling of the weapon to begin with. There's pulling of a trigger, cocking of the gun, right? And then there's other sort of like mechanical noises. Then there's the gunshot itself, but then there's the bullet whizzing by. There's got to be an impact into a surface of some kind, and then there's usually some sort of fallout sounds too. What is the consequence of the impact of whatever the gunshot hit? So there's all these different types of sounds that are all wrapped around one core sound effect. So don't make sure that you're being comprehensive with that and not missing out on some of those important reactionary sounds. Okay, moving on to Foley, which is still dealing with hard effects, but is more a particular method in which we're recording them. So this was created by a guy by the name of Foley in the 20s and 30s for radio dramas. And basically what you're doing now is recording sound effects during, while actually watching the video playback, right? So maybe you've got production sound and you've got production video and you're watching these things, and you're creating sounds with props while the action is happening. So you can potentially be more efficient in the way that you work, right? You're going to be able to generate a lot of sounds in a lot quicker of a way, and you get to be super creative in the process of figuring out how to make these sounds. What is also nice about it is you're creating unique sounds for your particular project while you're doing this. You're not using some sort of stock sound effect that exists in a library like a Wilhelm scream that everybody's been using for 75 years. You're creating these things uniquely for yourself. Another big aspect of Foley is specific character sounds. So if you think about footsteps, think about clothing shuffling around when characters move. Without those kind of sounds, things sound empty and strange. So you need to be able to fill those things in, and it's a lot harder to just take a single recorded footstep and make a whole sequence out of it. What you would do is identify what this character is like, what kind of shoes are they wearing, and what kind of surfaces are they walking on, and you would recreate those sounds while you're watching the action, so you can, reenact what's happening and record quality recordings of those things. So quickly, here's a documentary showing the Foley process, which doesn't it look like the most amazing job of all time, just making sounds with random creative items that are around. So again, there's no expectation that you have a fancy microphone or a recording interface and stuff at home. If you can do any sort of Foley recording from your laptop microphone or anything, that would be cool to give it a try and see what you can do. But if we were recording this, in the industry, you refer to these as passes. So what you would do is you would take on one particular sound, let's say it's footsteps. You would put on the appropriate type of shoes and have a surface that sort of represents where the character is walking, and you would record a footsteps pass where you would then go through the process, right? Then you might do a cloth pass where you're just shuffling around the types of clothing that character is wearing. So you would kind of go through over and over and create a new layer for each one of these passes, and then take on sort of assume the role of a different one of those sounds that's required. So each character is going to be having footsteps of some kind. They've got cloth rustling and they're breathing. So these are different things that there's likely going to be visual cues for. Even when somebody's walking, you don't see their feet, you're going to hear the thing. So you have to look at their shoulders to know when they're walking to sort of cue the footsteps. So every character has those types of things. And in order to do this appropriately, you need to have a wide collection of stuff. And there is a bunch of resources out on the internet that will tell you, like from sound designers who have sort of collectively put together a list of how they achieved certain kinds of sounds, creative methods in which they've done that. Some of the classic ones is like breaking bones, is like vegetables, carrots, and celery, and twisting those things and creating those kind of cracking sounds. A body fall is oftentimes like a book bag filled with phone books and textbooks and stuff like that. So it can be interesting to sort of look into those things. But I wanted to show you some pictures of what these Foley, whether it's called Foley houses, places that do this type of production work for films, what they look like. Take a look at this place. So obviously lots of different, materials and props and, materials for walking on, creating different kinds of footsteps. Here's another one. So being able to see the picture and having the space to work to be able to do the kind of things that you might need to do. And just for good measure, I wanted to throw in my favorite piece of Foley from some sound design and film ever. It happens to be from 1991 in Terminator 2. Sound of the T-1000 walking through this jail cell. Hopefully you've seen this movie, but I realize it's quite a bit older than you guys now. Take a look at this scene, though. See if you can guess what this is.
It's okay, Mom. He's here to help. It's okay.
Alright, here's the sequence. Here's the sound. Alright, any guesses as to what that is? So, recording Foley to this, while that action is happening, they're looking at screen, there's a open can of wet dog food that they sort of like tossed the food out, and as it suctioned itself out of there, it created that noise. So just goes to show how creative you can be when you're doing this kind of stuff. Okay, that's it for hard effects and Foley. Have fun doing this. It's an incredible amount of work. This is likely going to be one of the larger portions of the project that you have to deal with. A lot of looking at your spotting notes and collecting of the sounds and synchronizing them in place. But it's pretty rewarding, and it's going to really make your scene start to take some shape. So have fun with it, and I'll see you next time.